Today we will look at the fourth demand of the covenant of love. And this is perhaps, they're all important, but this is perhaps the most important. Because as we go through this, we're going to see that in this fourth demand we receive what we really need to be able to faithfully keep the other 5 demands. The fourth demand is our specific Schoenstatt terminology, which says, diligently bring me contributions to the capital of grace. It's basically the Church's teaching on the theology of grace that our founder, guided by the Holy Spirit, put together in this form to help us to be always aware of grace and to make use of this great gift from God. So in order to understand this, we're going to first of all look at grace. We're going to do a review of grace. We're going to look at the concept of capital and then contributions. And then we will put it all together, and hopefully we will have gained an understanding into this demand, diligently bring me contributions to the capital of grace. What I'm going to do as I explain this is I'm going to walk you through. I'm not going to go through everything that's in this outline, but I will walk you through hitting the key points and then encouraging you afterwards to go through and read the entire chapter once again, and then you have it all put together, and hopefully we'll have gained a greater understanding. So we start out with grace. We know that grace, this is review for us probably, grace is a free gift from God, gratuitously granted to us in different degrees and varieties by His love and mercy. So grace is really a gift given to us freely by God. He gives it to us because He has this infinite love and mercy for us, and He gives it. We don't deserve it, because if we realize that grace is sharing in the divine life of God Himself, we partake of God's very own life. Who of us deserves such a gift? So it's out of His infinite love and mercy that God gives us this gift. And then we speak, of course, of 2 types of grace, sanctifying grace and actual grace. The definition of sanctifying grace: it is an habitual gift, a stable and supernatural disposition that perfects the soul itself to enable it to live with God, to act by His love. So sanctifying grace, the divine life of God, is meant to be an habitual grace. In other words, that once we receive it at baptism, that the idea is that it is to always be with it. It's to be a permanent possession, that we don't lose it. And we know that the only way that we can lose sanctifying grace is if we commit a mortal sin. We commit a mortal sin, we lose all the sanctifying grace, and once we go to confession, the sin is forgiven, then the sanctifying grace is restored. So it's meant to be permanent. Then we have the other type of grace, which we call actual grace. And actual grace is a special temporary help from the Holy Spirit, which enables us to know and do what God expects of us at a certain moment. It enlightens our mind, strengthens our will, and perfects our thoughts and actions. So sanctifying permanent possession, actual, a temporary or a helping grace that comes as we need it. And when we receive the actual grace, then it helps to enlighten our minds, strengthen our wills, so that we can decide and follow God. Now, I have found in another source a very interesting explanation of sanctifying actual grace and how they fit together. And I would just like to read a little bit from this book First of all, the definition of grace. Grace is an interior, supernatural gift. It's interior, supernatural, above nature. Interior, supernatural gift of God bestowed on us through the merits of Jesus Christ for our salvation. We know that Jesus merited all of the graces that we need through his suffering and death on the cross. Now, sanctifying grace. Sanctifying grace is sometimes called habitual grace because it is intended to be a habitual or permanent condition of the soul. Once we are united with God in baptism, it is intended that we remain united with him forever, invisibly here, visibly hereafter. So again, what I have just said. Now, going a little bit further into the study of sanctifying grace, it is important that we increase sanctifying grace within our soul. And it is capable of increase. So what we want to do is we want to increase the divine life of God within us. We want to increase sanctifying grace. The more the soul is purified of self, the more responsive does it become to the action of God. As self diminishes, sanctifying grace increases. And now listen to this. It is a degree of sanctifying grace that will determine the degree of our happiness in heaven. Here's an explanation. Two men, for example, looking at the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel will both find complete enjoyment in the sight of Michelangelo's masterpiece. But the man with the cultivated eye will find more enjoyment in it than the other man, whose artistic tastes are of a lower order. The man with little artistic appreciation will be quite satisfied. He will not be aware that he is missing anything, but he will be missing a lot. Similarly, we all shall be perfectly happy in heaven, but the degree of our happiness will depend upon the spiritual sharpness of our vision. That in turn will depend upon the degree to which sanctifying grace has permeated our soul. In other words, we definitely all will be happy in heaven, but there are different degrees of happiness. It's like the example, if I have here a thimble, and this thimble is filled with water, and over here I have a 10-gallon bucket, and this bucket is filled with water. They're both full to their capacity. And so it's the same with us. We will be happy in heaven, but there will be different degrees. And our degree of happiness in heaven will definitely be determined by the degree of sanctifying grace. Because the more sanctifying grace we have, the more divine life of God we have in our soul, the holier we are, the more we line ourselves with God's will. We also know that Jesus said that he was going to prepare a mansion for us. And we can use the same idea and say that if we want a really big and beautiful mansion, that will be determined by the degree of sanctifying grace, by the degree of holiness. There is this legend told of a man who thought he lived a very good life. He died. St. Peter meets him at the gate and tells him, "I'm going to take you now to your mansion." And so they go down the street, and there's these beautiful, beautiful, big mansions. And the man, being very justified, thinks that one of those belongs to him. And St. Peter doesn't take him up to one, and they continue, and then there's some mansions that aren't quite as nice, but also very beautiful. And those aren't for the man either. And so it continues on and on till we get to these little shacks. And St. Peter says, okay, here's your mansion. And the man said, but really, I think I deserve more than that. And St. Peter simply said, that's the material that you sent up while you were on earth for us to build your mansion. The way we live our life. How aligned am I with God's will? And of course, to be able to be so perfectly aligned with God's will, we need a lot of sanctifying grace. Look at the Blessed Mother. The angel Gabriel said to her, greeted her, "Hail, full of grace, full of God." How could the Blessed Mother be so attuned to discern God's will? Because she was full of grace. Where did the Blessed Mother get the strength to be able to carry out God's will once she recognized it? And God asked many hard things of her. Standing under the cross, for example. How could she do it? Because she had God's life. She was full of grace. So we do absolutely need to increase the life of grace within us. These then are our three needs with regard to sanctifying grace. First, that we preserve it permanently. That's the bottom line. And until the end. Secondly, that we recover it immediately if we have lost it by mortal sin. And thirdly, that we seek to grow in sanctifying grace with an eagerness that sees the sky as the limit. That here we can be, in quotes, very greedy, that we want more and more and more sanctifying grace. So these are the three things. Now, none of these three things is easy to do. In fact, by our human wisdom and strength alone, none of these three things is even possible. Cannot do it. Get it, keep it, get it back once it's lost, and increase it. Cannot do it out of our own strength. Impossible. And listen why. Like a bombed victim, wandering dazed and weakened from the ruins, so has human nature staggered down through the centuries from the explosive rebellion of original sin. Judgment permanently warped, will permanently weakened. It is so hard to recognize danger in time. So hard to look honestly at the greater good that needs doing. So hard to turn our gaze from the hypnotic beckoning of sin. So you see, we have such a broken nature as a consequence of original sin. So out of our own strength, we cannot do it. We can't increase the life of grace. We can't keep it. And once it's lost, we can't get it back. It's impossible for us out of our own power and strength. Because just think of that, a bombed victim wandering dazed and weakened from the ruins. So there comes in now actual grace. That is why sanctifying grace, like a king surrounded by a retinue of servants, is preceded by and accompanied by a whole train of special helps from God. These special helps we call actual grace. So if you understand the image, it's like sanctifying grace here is the king. We absolutely need it. And the actual graces are like the servants, the guards, protecting the sanctifying grace. So let's say, for example, that I was not baptized as a child, but only as an adult. In order to get me to that point, I needed actual grace. Let's say I lose sanctifying grace by mortal sin. I need actual grace to get me back into the box, to go to confession. Out of my own strength, I can't do it. You see? Then, to keep increasing it, encouraging me to go to the Eucharist, to do the things that increase the life of grace, I need actual grace. So there, it just shows you very, very beautifully how the two fit together. Sanctifying grace is the king, the actual grace, the servants around it to protect the king, to increase the sanctifying grace. And then just a couple other thoughts about grace, how important it is, and we will go into it in more detail. It says here, indeed, I think that one of the biggest surprises on Judgment Day will be to discover how little we have had to do with our own salvation. We shall be amazed to learn how continually and completely God's grace has surrounded us and accompanied us all through life. During this life, we do occasionally recognize God's hand. Once in a while, we can say, God's grace surely was with me. But on Judgment Day, we shall see that for every grace which we have recognized, there have been 100 or 10,000 other, more hidden graces of which we have been totally unconscious. Our surprise, too, will be mixed with shame. We go through life, most of us, patting ourselves on the back for our little victories. We said no to that drink which would have been one too many. We changed our mind about going out with that person who might have meant sin for us. We held our tongue when we wanted to make a biting and angry reply. We rolled out of bed for weekday Mass when our body was crying in protest. And we pat ourselves on the back and think we're quite a hero. And then on Judgment Day, we shall get our first square look at ourselves. We shall see the full picture of the workings of grace in our life. We shall see how little we ourselves had to do with our heroic decisions and our supposedly noble deeds. Almost we can imagine God smiling at us in loving amusement as He sees us, as He hears us exclaim in confusion, "Why, God, it was you all the time." So in other words, what we're saying here is that any good thing that you and I do is God's grace. It's not us. We can't even have one good thought in our mind without God's grace. So we see how much we need grace. The sanctifying grace and the actual grace. And now if we stay in this same line and just summarize the importance of grace, there are 4 major reasons why we really need grace. First of all, since original sin weakened our nature and we are thus subject to sin and failure, we cannot free ourselves from this bondage of sin by our own power and strength. Since we have this ability to slide easier into sin, into the bondage of sin, we need sanctifying grace and actual grace to help us not to slide in, and once we slide in, to help us to get out of that situation again, we need grace. Second reason, we need the redemptive grace of Christ to grow more into His likeness and image, into a union with Him. Because we know our life is not all about just trying to get by and avoid the big major sins. Our life is about growing in holiness, to become as perfect as we possibly can become, to be that real image of God in our world today. To do that, we need lots of grace. The third reason we need grace, we need divine life in order to become perfect instruments in His hands, totally at His disposal for His plans. Because as we've been saying all along, we know that our life is all about doing God's will, being in line with His will. Go back to looking at the Blessed Mother. Because she was full of grace, she could discern God's will and carry it out. The same applies for us. We need a lot of grace to discern what is God's will. And then many times we need a lot of grace to carry it out. And the last reason why we need grace, we need this grace so that we may join God in His glory in heaven and partake in His everlasting happiness. In other words, we know that we need to die in the state of sanctifying grace if we want to enter eternal happiness. So we see how important grace is. Now, another point that we need to look at just briefly as we try to understand diligently bring me contributions to the capital of grace, we're still focusing on grace. We need to look at the human cooperation with grace. Christ merited the gift of grace for us through His death on the cross. He redeemed us all and gives everyone a chance to gain eternal glory with God in heaven. This is objective redemption. So objectively, we've all been redeemed. Jesus suffered and died for us. We have been redeemed. However, this objective redemption has to become a subjective redemption, a personal experience and reality for every person. Even though Christ merited divine life for us all, we must cooperate and make this grace available to ourselves. That is subjective redemption. So it's this idea, trying to explain a supernatural concept, a mysterious